Good morning, everyone. We are up to Parakeh, chapter 5, Mishnah Ches, Mishnah 8. This is actually the final Mishnah of this tractate of Mishnah Masris. And tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem will be starting a new Masechta of Mishnah of Meiser Sheni. That will be tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem, beginning tomorrow morning. But today is the last Mishnah of Maseches Masris, and it reads like this. As we know, that things that are ownerless, there is no obligation to separate Shumas and Maasros from them. So if something grows in the wild, it's ownerless, there is no obligation to separate anything from it. So now the Mishnah is going to list a number of different types of produce that if you come upon them, and I believe this means you come upon them by somebody selling them, whatever it may be, you may assume that this was not raised on someone's farm. This person collected it ownerless. This person had got it ownerless, and therefore there is no obligation to separate Shumas and Maasros. So the first example, or the first produce that's mentioned is Shum Baal Bechi. Shum is garlic. Baal Bechi has two translations, either from the word Baal Bechi. Bechi means to cry. Garlic that makes you cry, a certain type of very sharp garlic that made you cry when you ate it. Or it means Baal Bechi was a place in Lebanon. So as the article translates it as Lebanese garlic. Ubatzol shel Richpa. Richpa was the name of a place, the onions of Richpa. Ugrisin ha-kilkelin. Or Grisin kilkelin, Kilki was the name of a place. So they translate here as Cilician split beans. So Grisin is a split bean, and it's from this place called Kilki, Cilicia. And as the notes here brings down from the bottom, it brings down, these were beans that were square shaped. Egyptian lentils. Rabbi Meir says, Afa carcass, a certain type carcass was also a certain type of right. Carcass is a certain type of a cabbage. Rabbi Yossi Omer Afa Kitnim. Rabbi Yossi includes a couple he calls kitnim. Kitnim is also a type of lentil. On all of these, the Mishnah says, Peturim and Maasros. They are exempt from separating Shumas and Maasros. Again, if you come upon them, you can assume that they not only come, I believe it means come upon them on the ground, because if they're out in the forest, that's obvious. But it means that when you see someone selling that, but if this is what he's handling, then you can assume that they grew in the wild. That means they were acquired from Hefker, from being ownerless, and from a state of being ownerless, and there's no obligation of Shumas and Maasros from it. Now, happens to be that if, let's say, you know that any one of these things was grown privately, then it will have obligation of Shumas and Maasros. The reason Mishnah says it's exempt is because the assumed status of these things are that they grew ownerless. And we seem to have an argument in the Mishnah because Rabbi Meir added karkas, Rabbi Yossi mentioned kutnim, which the first opinion of Tanna Kama didn't mention, which means Tanna Kama disagrees. Tanna Kama would hold that regarding these other two species, you can't assume they grew in the wild. Apparently, there was more chances of them being grown privately, and therefore the Tanna Kama said that those two mentioned, the one mentioned by Rabbi Meir and by Rabbi Yossi would not have any obligation to separate Shumas and Maasros from it. Another thing the Mishnah mentions about these things that you can assume is that you could buy them from anyone during the Shemitah year. Now, during the Shemitah year, if a person, let's say, had something growing in his own field and he didn't let people come take it, he guarded it like an owner, he's not allowed to sell them. You're not allowed to buy them anymore once they were treated that way. He has to just let them be ownerless. Now, let's say you're dealing with a person who we suspect does not observe the laws of Shemitah, and he's selling these all these things we just listed. Being that all these things that again listed grew in the wild, they didn't grow on anybody's field, they grew in the wild. They too, the halacha is, you can assume that they weren't guarded by this person. They grew in the wild. They weren't guarded. He just picked them from the wild. And therefore, if so, there are no issues with them there's no issues with them. And you don't have to be concerned that he guarded them. Right. me just read it to you. Although we are not allowed to buy most forms of produce from such a person out of concern that he guarded them, meaning as they grew in his field, these species can be assumed to have grown ownerless in the wild and not in a guarded field. That's where they grew. They grew in a ownerless place. They were not guarded, and therefore there is no problem buying them from this person. My understanding is the fact that afterwards he picks them and now he does guard them. That's not the issue. The issue is were they guarded as they were growing, meaning that these grow in the wild. You don't have to assume otherwise that they were guarded, no reason to assume they were guarded, and therefore you can buy them even from this person who typically we wouldn't buy things from him, because since we suspect that he's not observant of Shemitah, we have to suspect that he did guard what grew in his yard. Again, it may have grown on its own, but he guarded it, which he's not allowed to do, and therefore he's not allowed to sell it. These things we assume grew in the wild. They were not guarded, and therefore there's no prohibition buying it during the. Now the Mishnah gets into a different halach, and that is that produce that's edible has an obligation of Trumas and Maasros. If it's not edible, it doesn't. Now there are seeds that are sometimes edible, sometimes not edible. If they're not edible, they don't have the obligation. You don't have to separate Trumas and Maasros from them. If they are edible, then they're just food that grew, and therefore you got to separate. So our Mishnah is going to list a number of seeds that are exempt from Trumas and Maasros because they're not edible. Zera luf ha'elyon is translated as luf is a type of a onion that usually grows in the wild. We're talking about the seed of wild luf. That's what they translate luf. Wild luf here, luf ha'elyon is wild luf. This onion that grew wild. Typically it grew in the wild. That's why it's called the wild luf. But that's not the reason why it's exempt here. The issue here is not that it grew in the wild. It typically grows in the wild. That's why it gets its name. But here we're discussing the seeds that come out of it. So even if you took this, even if you grew this wild luf in your backyard, and therefore it itself could have an obligation theoretically to have Trumas and Maasros, the discussion here are the seeds. And the seeds, as these are seeds that are not edible, and therefore there is no obligation of separating Trumas and Maasros from them. Zera luf ha'elyon, the seed of the wild luf, v'zera kreshim, leek seeds, zera betzolim, onion seeds, zera lefas utznainis, turnip and radish seeds, usha'ar zarayni gina shenim nechalim, and any other garden seeds that are not edible, peturim min ha'maasros. There is no obligation to separate Trumas and Maasros from them because they're not edible. If you have things that do produce edible seeds, like garlic seeds are considered edible, they do have an obligation Trumas and Maasros from them. But these seeds are not edible, therefore there's no obligation of Trumas and Maasros from them. And again, you can purchase them from anybody during Shemitah. If they're not edible, they don't have the status of Shemitah produce, and therefore no matter who's selling them, even someone who we suspect does not observe Shemitah properly, you can buy it from him. Okay. Then the Mishnah concludes in the following way. Even if their original seed was truma, they can still be eaten. Now what that means is like this. We have a rule to do like truma. If you take truma, something that was designated as truma, real truma, you take a seed from that, let's say that grain, and you plant it. You're not allowed to plant it, but you did. So the sages decreed that what grows from truma has the status of truma. According to Torah law, it's not. What grows from it does not have the status of truma. But it's a rabbinic decree that it does have the status of truma. That's the typical rule. Now we're talking about what would it be in this case? What would be in our case when you took an non-edible seed that, because it's not edible, really has an obligation for Trumas and Maasros. However, sages decreed you have to treat it like truma. Once it was called truma, it has to be treated like truma in the sense that now the only person who can do anything with them is a person who's a Kohen. These seeds would be forbidden to a non-Kohen to, again, they may not be edible, but if he decides he's going to eat them, he wouldn't be allowed to if he's not a Kohen. The rabbinic decree said here that once it's called truma, you have to treat it like truma to the point that a non-Kohen is forbidden to have them, to eat them. However, our Mishnah is teaching us the following. Let's say one of these non-edible seeds that you said they're truma. Let's say you planted them, and then something grew from that seed. And that the Mishnah says, even though the father, meaning the original seed that was planted, was truma meaning you had declared it as truma, that you declared it as truma, and rabbinically it was decreed to be treated like truma, still what grows from them, harei elu ya'achlu. What grows can be eaten, and you don't have to worry about truma. And the reason is because that being that the whole halacha of what grows from truma is rabbinic decree, and these seeds which are not edible, that you made them truma, are only truma again because of rabbinic decree. In that rabbinic decree, that where you declare the non-edible seeds truma, we treat it like truma, they didn't add to that the other decree that what grows from it is considered truma. And therefore, the non-edible seeds, there's no obligation of trumas and maasros from them. If you declare it truma, it will get the status of truma that somebody's not a non-Kohen, it's forbidden to eat them. If you plant them and now something grows from them, which is perfectly edible, it still doesn't have the status of truma, even though typically what grows from truma is truma. Here, that rule does not apply, and therefore what grows from them is not truma. Okay, so Mazel Tov, we completed the Maseches, the tractate of Mishna Maasros, and Amrit Hashem will begin a new tractate of Meiser Sheni. Okay. Now we begin Klal Beis, the second chapter of the Laws of Lashon Harah of the Chavetz Chaim. Now, the first halacha is going to be a quick halacha, which we're going to do this quick halacha today. I don't think we're going to start, not going to start the next one today. Actually, let's see what happens. But let's read the first, let's read this. Asur lasaper Lashon Harah chaveroi avshu emes afilu b'fnei yachid. It's forbidden to speak Lashon Harah about someone, even if it's the truth, even if it's only in front of one person. V'chol shekei listening, Yisrabah and Masaper, the sin of the one speaking Lashon Harah increases. And that's because a person becomes more derided, so to speak, by the fact that what he did bad becomes publicized by more people. Meaning, if this person were to know that this thing is that people are talking about him, it would hurt him more. The more people who know about it, the more it would hurt him. It would hurt him personally. It could actually hurt him in some other kind of, in a physical or in a monetary way. Whatever it is, the more people who know the bad about someone, the worse it is for that person. And this was spoken forbiddenly because it was Lashon Harah. And therefore, the more you now defame or put down your friend, because the more people now know about this negative thing about him, the greater the sin. It's also a greater sin according to how many people listen, because another problem is that the more people you listen, the more people listening to you, they're not going to listen to your Lashon Harah. So the more people you're speaking to, the more people you're causing to sin. That, of course, increases the severity of what you're doing also. You're getting more sins. The more people listening, the more sins of causing someone to listen to Lashon Harah, which is the sin that we mentioned before of causing someone to stumble in doing something wrong, the more of that increases upon you. So therefore, speaking Lashon Harah to many people typically is not going to be something permissible. Why should it be permissible? But that is now what the Chavetz Chaim is going to now begin discussing, about the fact that we do find in the Gemara, in the Talmud, that there are situations where it comes, where the Gemara states that if you're speaking Lashon Harah in front of more than one person, you're speaking Lashon in front of three people specifically, if three people or more, that there it seems that there are statements being made that there, it would seem it could come across to people like, in those situations, you could speak Lashon Harah. And the Chavetz Chaim comes to discuss that, comes to discuss all those sources that seem to say you could speak Lashon Harah then, it's not a problem Lashon Harah then. That's going to be his discussion. And he's discussing at length, go through many different details about it, and not to spoil your fun for the future, but at the end of the day, he's going to say it's highly unreliable to rely on these things, these seemingly exceptions to the rule to speak Lashon in front of three people. There are going to be some of those ideas he's going to right away dispel, and some of them that do seem to have a place in halach as an exception to the rule when it comes to laws of Lashon Harah. He's going to qualify them, explain them, and at the end come out that it's not really something good to rely upon. But this is what now this entire chapter is going to be dedicated to. This entire concept of explaining that means to say that when you speak Lashon in front of three people, that the laws or different parts of Lashon Hara don't apply. And we'll begin that tomorrow. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy your Thanksgiving. Stay safe.